Hello and welcome to the coffee table. Just gonna talk about some quick things here and there, things that have caught my interest, and mainly politics and a little bit of political philosophy. Barely scripted, barely edited, but I think it's interesting. And there's interesting stuff to talk about, particularly with what's been blowing up on the news lately. Iran and the current airstrikes against its nuclear facilities and the implications that has for the Iranian people, because we all talk about Iran as this Islamist totalitarian regime, but most people don't know much about it. I mean, besides that it's the bad country, that what George Bush talked about as the axis of evil. Beyond that, most people don't know very much about it. But that really hides Iran's fascinating history, and a fascinating history that warrants investigation when we look at the current climate, especially with Iran now very much in the news, and the great gulf between this radical Islamist government and its actually quite liberal population, and how that government came to power can, I think, be very informative about the possibility of a US-backed regime change, which is very much in the news. Donald Trump has talked about how he's considering regime change in Iran, and that's been something that's floated around US policy circles for a long time, going all the way back to 9/11 in the 2000s. Both Israel and the United States have long said that they are interested in a regime change, and I think now there is a genuine possibility that that could come about, because whereas before the US was mostly focused on Afghanistan and Iraq, both of those players now having been either dealt with or too difficult to deal with, now finally the turn comes to a very much weakened Iran, and what the future may hold is complicated. And I think to understand the complicated situation that regime change would create for Iran, the difficulties involved in pursuing that regime change, I think it's important to look at how that regime change came about, and we can talk about the likelihood and the results of that regime change only by examining it within the predecessors, the Iranian Revolution, where the Ayatollahs, the spiritual leaders and supreme leaders of Iran, took power. This was in 1978, 1979, and before the supreme leaders and the Ayatollahs, which we now understand to be the leaders of Iran, it was ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. Shah being the title here. The Shah of Iran is roughly analogous to that of emperor, and is a very, very old title used by some variation by Iranian rulers since the Achaemenid dynasty over 2,500 years ago. Mostly Shah of Shahs, King of Kings is the often title. You've probably heard it before, and it is a very ancient title that Mohammad Reza and his father before him claimed to hold. And though they were claiming this ancient title, and it may seem on the surface that this is this ancient dynasty, and they very much wanted to present that image of being a successor to this ancient legacy, in reality, the Pahlavi dynasty was always been a very precarious and vulnerable dynasty in a very unstable country. It was never secure, and its eventual collapse was a long time coming, and had been built up for decades in a very turbulent half century for Iran that eventually ended in the rise of the Islamic Republic. But I think the first bit to start out is, what is Iran? Like, what is it as a country? And that's a difficult question to answer, because when we think of Iran, a lot of the times we think of Persian or Persia as the single ethnic group. It's that we only think of that main dominant idea of this Persian Empire that fought the Greeks 2,000 years ago, and the Sassanids and the Parthians, that this ancient culture, and that is very true. Iran is dominated by the majority Persian ethnic group and Persian culture and Persian language, but there is a reason Iran is not called Persia. Iran is more than just Persians, and there are many other minority religious and ethnic groups that have complicated relationships with Tehran. I think the perfect example of this is Balochistan, which is in the southeast of the country on the border between Pakistan, where there has been a long-standing insurgency. The Balochistan people are a different ethnic group with a different language to standard Persians and have long felt oppressed by both Pakistan and Persia. They've had a long-standing insurgency. By 1973, there was already Balochistan insurgents in rebellion against the Shah, and that continued up to the revolution and continued well after it. We can still see, even today, there are Balochistan revolutionaries engaging in terrorist acts in Iran and currently engaged in insurgency. The Shah's actual control over these regions has always been tenuous, and this is the same with Iran today. It's always been on the fringes of a central Persian core. And when you look to these regions, you look at the Kurds, the Azerbaijanis, the Balochi, you can see the great difficulty in maintaining that control. And when the revolution came about when that position at the exterior started deteriorating, we started to see also a deterioration of power in the core region. So I think that this is one of the key aspects of Iran that keeps coming back to haunt successive Iranian governments is this precariousness on its borders, that Iran has always had a very fuzzy hinterland that regularly serves to bite the government in the ass, and that has continued to be the case. The Pahlavi dynasty itself came into power in the aftermath of the constitutional revolution in 1925. This revolution was against the original Qajar dynasty of Shahs that ruled before the Pahlavi and who had opposed liberalization and reform. Eventually, Riva Pahlavi, the father of Muhammad Riva Pahlavi, engaged in a coup. He commanded two small Cossack regiments that marched into Tehran and with little fanfare overthrew a dynasty that had been ruling for over 230 years with little much of a fight. They were now in charge and with little support beyond a few Cossacks. And Pahlavi was now placed in a very difficult position. He was now in charge of a country with many differing factions wanting very different things. The people he originally supported and the people who he had the most connection to were the liberal population who were clamoring for greater Western style reform. And Riva did want a more secularist republic along the lines of the Kemalist Turkey. Kemalism being the ideology of Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turks, who, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, pursued this secular Western-style republic that banned most public forms of worship, of specifically Islamic, and was very Western, very focused on education for women, on developing the country, of abandoning backward ways. And to Riva Pahlavi, that was quite seductive. He wanted to be this modern, forward-thinking, to abandon this ancient past, but at the same time, his own troops, the Cossacks, the army, and the clergy that were incredibly important in Iran at the time. The clergy had a great deal of influence. Same thing with the army. Both of them did not want this secular republic that would have challenged their influence and control in the country. Instead, they preferred to have a monarchy. And so Riza, with no legitimate claim to the throne, he was not in any way related to the Qajar dynasty or any other previous dynasty. He took the throne as a way to appease the clergy and the army while also making promises to his liberal base that he would promote development and promote greater reform. A constitution. And this precarious position on the balance between two, of a conservative and a liberal on the one side, meant that the Shahs were always in a very precarious position. They were not secure. They had gained their throne through a coup. They were little more than upstart dictators. You could compare him to Kemal. He's very little different from that. But now he's claiming this ancient title that he has no real legitimacy to. And this forces him to go a different route. Instead of your usual tactics with monarchs as this bastion of tradition, the Shahs of Iran kind of had to be both this ancient institution and at the same time be this liberalizing force for the country. They had to be both because they did not have the proper legitimacy within ancient traditions needed to just rely on one. They had to be something else to keep the country together. And so Riza Shah, it began a massive expansion in public education and Iranian industry and infrastructure, all as a part of secularizing and developing the country. If you go look at photos of Riza Shah, you won't see him in traditional Iranian wear or Islamic wear. You'll see him in a Western style military uniform. And that's a deliberate choice. He wanted this secular republic loyal. He wanted a secular country loyal to him and that would defend him. And so he created the first Western style university in Iran that admitted female students with no mandatory hijab wearing. In fact, quite the opposite. He enforced European style conscription on the country, and for civil servants mandated Western style uniforms and dress. A lot of this was deeply unpopular at the time, especially in a country that was quite conservative. Iran, though, was being forced in this direction. Like a lot of the Middle East at the time, especially Turkey, was always a bit more hesitant. It had always been on the fringes of European colonialism. It had never been fully colonized. It had always been subservient, and had always been, I would say, partially colonized, but it had always been on the fringes. And as such, there was a lot of pushback to this. In the end, this careful balancing act the Shahs did, balancing both liberalism and their conservative Shah, would ultimately be their downfall. They could not maintain this balance forever because on the one hand, they wanted to be that liberalizing force, but on the other, they needed repression. They needed to be this conservative autarky to maintain the support of the clergy, the army, and to just maintain their own power. The Shahs were incredibly totalitarian. There was no doubt about that, even though they made lip service to democratic reform and a parliament. Both Riza Shah and his son, Muhammad Riza Shah, never particularly cared about democracy so much as they cared about there was strict press censorship under both Pahlavi Shahs, and although they claimed to be constitutional monarchs with a prime minister and a parliament, these were mostly toothless. There were periods where the parliament would gain more power. In the lead up to the 1953 coup, for example, the parliament did gain a substantial bit of power, but most of the time it was the Shah who ruled directly, appointing his prime ministers and making the parliament effectively toothless, especially in the later Muhammad Shah's reign. You also see the use of the Savak, the Iranian secret police, becoming more prevalent. It was a efficient machine. It's the Iranian Gestapo. It tortured prisoners, arrested political opponents and dissidents, published propaganda. It did a wide range of things and was quite brutal in its tactics. But though they were effective at suppressing dissidents, they could not find a way to keep it perfect lid on it, because though they did engage in a lot of repression, they failed to really stem the growing resistance, because while they have all the strict repression that forces the general public out of government, they are also developing this middle class that wants political representation, that wants this parliament, but they are being denied political power, being actively repressed by the security apparatus because the Shah does not trust them. The Shah wants to have these middle class people, but does not trust them with political power. He wants his cake and he wants to be able to eat it too. And it's this balancing act that's incredibly difficult to pull off. And on top of all of this difficult balancing act, the Shahs are lining their own pockets, especially Mohammad Reza, when the oil crisis began in the 1970s, which saw a massive rise in oil prices due to OPEC. There was rampant inflation and shortages in Iran due to the crisis. But at the same time, the Shah grew incredibly wealthy due to the bump in oil prices that allowed a massive influx into the state treasury. But a lot of this went to the Shah and not exactly the general public. There was a lot of economic mismanagement. They failed to tackle the inflation. They failed to tackle the shortages. There was a inadequate infrastructure for their massive ports that were almost all focused on supplying oil to the rest of the world, but not enough to get the actual food, medicine that people desperately needed. And instead of fixing these issues, instead, the Shah decides to hold this massive celebration for the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, which included this construction of a massive tent city around the ancient Achaemenid Persian capital of Persepolis, around the ruins. It cost roughly $22 million at the time, which was a massive expense for a relatively poor country compared to it was an absolutely extravagant event. Muhammad Reza invited hundreds of dignitaries from all over the world, including the Queen Elizabeth II of England, though she did not attend. This to really go to show you how much this was a demonstration of the Shah's extravagant wealth. And though the later Islamic government trumped up the costs and sheer extravagance of the ceremony, in reality, it likely had little impact on the actual revolution, as it did not drain the coffers. The Iranian finances were perfectly fine. They could bear the expenses, but it's more that the Shahs were very much out of touch with the general Iranian public, were more concerned with hosting this extravagant party than actually helping the people in their country. And sticking with the theme of oil, Iran has long been incredibly rich in oil, and with this massive oil reserves comes the interests of those who desperately need it, particularly the British and Americans, who have long had interests and influence over Iran since the 1700s, especially Britain. Since the 1800s, most of Iran's oil was controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or the AIOC, which though was jointly owned by the Iranian government and British shareholders. Most of the profits, 75%, went to the shareholders in London, and including some other investors such as in Kuwait or American, with only 17% going to the Iranian government. Not to mention the fact that the crucial importance of this oil to the British Navy, and it supplied much of the oil to the British Empire, and Iran was only getting 17% of that wealth. It was a, quite frankly, extortionate deal, and it was backed with the force of guns. Jeez. In 1941, at the height of World War II, there was a fear that the Germans would invade Iran, or that would use their influence over Reza Pahlavi to secure control of Iran's oil fields. And out of fear, both the Soviets and the British invaded, just straight up landed troops to little resistance. Reza Pahlavi himself was forced to abdicate his throne to his son, because neither the British nor the Soviets actually trusted him to maintain their position. He fled into exile. But this was only the prelude to an even greater intervention, that being in 1953, coup. So in 1951, the Iranian parliament, got into a disagreement with the AIOC over renegotiating their original contract. Again, Iran was only getting 17%, and the AIOC was willing to see their share rise to about 25%. That's as high as they were willing to go. And the parliament, being led by this firebrand nationalist, Mohammad Mossadegh, rejected this, what was called a new supplementary agreement. Instead, Mossadegh demanded, along with the parliament, that instead the profits be split 50-50, which was the standard at the time between oil companies and countries. Similar deals had been struck with Venezuela at the time between American companies and the Venezuelan government. But the AIOC rejected this out of hand. They said that Iran should be grateful for their civilizing mission to the country, and said that a 50-50 deal would dramatically hurt their interests and prevent production. This was obviously not true. A 50-50 split would definitely have been possible for the AIOC, but quite frankly, as they told the British Foreign Office, that a 50-50 split would significantly harm shareholder profits, and they could not allow that, especially when considering the largest shareholder was the British government, and the British government had a direct connection to the AIOC and directly relied on the AIOC because it was the main supplier for the British fleet, it was the main supplier for the British army. Without AIOC oil, the British economy would grind to a halt. And so when the Parliament rejected the supplementary agreement, they went a step further and completely nationalized the AIOC, with Mohammad Mossadegh being appointed prime minister by the Parliament, essentially taking control away from the Shah. But this pissed off the British. Nationalization was a no-go for the British. They were fine with a 50-50 split, but the Mossadegh had taken it too far with nationalization. As far as the British were concerned, if Iran controlled its oil, they could control oil prices, and it could hurt the British economy and navy, because at this time the AIOC and Iran more generally was one of the largest producers of oil in the world, far more than it is today. And if they used this leverage over Britain, it could seriously hurt their influence in the region. And as far as the Foreign Office were concerned, Mossadegh had to be removed from, and control of Iran's oil fields had to be returned to the AIOC. But there was a snag. The Mossadegh government was relatively popular with Iranians, and though despite the British launching a massive propaganda campaign using their financial resources to put pressure on the government, it did not collapse. And without any real strength anymore that they used to possess, the British had been severely weakened after the Suez Crisis. They now needed to convince Washington of the threat of Mossadegh and Iranian control of oil. And they succeeded by telling the American government and American oil companies that though their preference for a 50-50 split was fine, if Iran was allowed to nationalize, this could have serious implications for other countries, Indonesia, Venezuela. If they were allowed to nationalize, then the world's supply of oil could become controlled by other people besides America and the British. And Washington could not allow this to happen. Truman flirted with the idea of supporting the coup. He was hesitant, especially after the US getting out of World War II. But it was really when Eisenhower comes into power that you see the US fully embrace the idea of a coup in Iran. Eisenhower engaged in coups throughout his tenure, such as in the Congo, and he was more than committed to overthrowing Mossadegh. And there was only one person in their minds who would replace him, the Shah of Iran. Mohammad Reza's support was necessary for the coup, as he had the personal loyalty of many officers. He took a keen interest in military affairs far more than economic or general social issues, and he would personally supervise promotions of major officials. He examined dress uniforms and weapons and all these other minute details, partly out of interest, but also realizing that the army was key to his power and control over the country, which will become very relevant later. And because he had personally selected many of these prominent patricians and generals within the Iranian military also were contacted by the British and gave their support. The most prominent of these being General Zahedi, who presented himself to the British as the best candidate to lead a coup against the government, as he had deep support within the clerical faction and the army. The Shah himself, after being approached by the British, was initially hesitant as well. He was worried that if he did not have the proper support, that Mossadegh would overthrow him as well. Eventually, the British and Americans convinced him to go along with the plan after gathering the support of the army, and in 1953, the coup went ahead. The Imperial Guard, roughly 800 troops, seized the prime minister and his cabinet while they were in bed, marching over to their house and brushing aside their few guards, while Zahedi, with a tank column, secured the national broadcaster and read out the royal proclamation that named him the new prime minister. It was a simple plan, and the coup executed without a hitch. Mossadegh was arrested, and the cabinet a new cabinet was installed, and now that Zahedi was in charge, the AIOC was restored, though under a 50-50 split for the country. This coup cemented British and American dominance over the country and especially maintained their control over Iranian oil, and the Shah, for his part, was more than happy to agree to these terms. He knew who buttered his bread. But this foreign influence and this control directly damaged the Shah's legitimacy in the eyes of the Iranian people, who they increasingly saw as a foreign puppet, which I wouldn't say is exactly true. The Shah wasn't just a vehicle for American decision makers, he was in charge, but we can say they did definitely have a great deal of influence on him, and he knew that without American or British support, his regime would collapse. He needed that support, but the regime did survive on its own, and I think Mossadegh probably would have been overthrown with or without American and British assistance. Mossadegh was not popular among the army, the clerics, or the Shah, and they were the ones with the real power in the country, not Mossadegh. And eventually, with the end of the 1953 coup, we can really see that this instability in this country that has led to foreign influence, regional dissidents, crackdowns on liberal opposition, this is a perfect breeding ground for dissidents in this bubbling cauldron of chaos and resentment. And one of the most prominent figures to emerge from this would be Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini himself was a longtime cleric and religious leader. He was of a particularly fundamentalist Shia branch and had been for a long time an outspoken critic of the Shah's liberal reforms with regards to women and secularization, but also the British and American hold over Iran. In 1964, he was forced into exile by the Shah, and it was abroad in Turkey that he first concocted the idea of a Islamic republic, which rejected monarchy and mixed Islamic fundamentalism with this sort of pseudo-republicanism. So you would have a legislator and a president and a judiciary that would all be under supervision of this clerical council and a supreme leader who would have ultimate authority, who would also command the army and the security forces, while there would also be this general day-to-day running government with a president. And this idea itself was not that popular in Iran when Khomeini was in exile, but Khomeini was a charismatic figure. He did have a way with words, and his radical ideology was good to get on television. It was bold, it was provocative, and a lot of Western news media became quite interested in him, especially during the revolution, where he would give hundreds of interviews and appearances that would make him an incredibly prominent figure in the Iranian opposition, especially his criticisms, which were widely circulated in mosques within Iran. And it would ultimately be him that would be the first spark of the Iranian Revolution. It was in January 1979 that the dam finally broke, as in response to petitions that Khomeini be allowed to return to the country. A news article was published by an anonymous government agent that denounced Khomeini as an Indian agent and a traitor to Iran. It was this very liable polemic against Khomeini, and when it reached his home in Qom, it sparked riots among his fanatic supporters who attacked the Shah's. They attacked the flags, they attacked any symbol they could get there, including soldiers. And what followed this was a series of escalating protests by both Khomeini and the liberal opposition against the Shah, which were both repeatedly suppressed. With every repression, backlash grew bigger and bigger and bigger. It was a series of escalation that eventually resulted in what we now know as Black Friday on the 8th of September. It was a planned protest with over 100,000 people in attendance, which was suspended by the prime minister without properly notifying the protesters. And because of that, it went ahead with the rally near Parliament. The soldiers, trying to protect the Parliament building and disperse the protesters because this was an illegal assembly, eventually fired on the protesters after being pelted with a few rocks. Roughly 64 people were killed, including women and children. This was a watershed moment for Iran, and after this, the Shah's authority began to rapidly disintegrate. Soon after, the prime minister was replaced, and what we see is a revolving door of prime ministers as the military grows increasingly overstretched, trying to maintain control. The protests only ramp up, discontent grows, the army can no longer contain these protests, and though the Shah is trying everything, he's changing prime ministers go there, he's running out of options. And at this time, support for Khomeini only grows. He's getting more interviews with the West that essentially allows him to become the leader of the opposition movement, this singular unifying figure that everyone can point to as their leader to fight against the Shah. And this allows him to get massive support, especially among the conservative base, and millions gathered in protests to support him and his vision for Islamic republics against the Shah. Though he himself was not the only opposition figure, there were liberal opposition as well as socialist, communist, left-wing oppositions. They mostly worked with Khomeini and again let Khomeini be the leader in the hopes that they would eventually cast him aside once they had secured power, because Khomeini was still in exile. Though he was a famous figure at the time, the liberal and left opposition were just as, or if not more powerful than him, even though he was the face of the movement. But with their face now established, the Shah was desperate and could now see the clear writing on the wall. He eventually decided to go into exile and flee Iran to Egypt and left a new government in charge under Prime Minister Bakhtiar. This created chaos in this. Prime Minister attempted to establish a new direction, abolish all the secret police, and move the country towards liberalization. This presented a window for Khomeini to return to the country, even though Bakhtiar tried to prevent it. Khomeini did land, and he did establish his own provisional government in opposition to Bakhtiar. And now you have these two provisional governments, both claiming to be the legitimate one, supported by the opposition and Khomeini, and the other being the remnants of the Shah. And it was this confusion over who's legitimate government and who to support that paralyzed the army. Before, the army had been mostly loyal to the Shah, but now with this chaos, it had become paralyzed by indecision. And with cadets and other army officers defecting to the new side, military high command decided, in order to maintain their own strength and fighting back, decided to declare neutrality, which in the end was a serious mistake. Without the army support, Bakhtiar's government effectively collapsed. The revolutionaries swept through their buildings and quickly seized control of almost all government offices. And he was able to rally most of the revolutionaries to his side, and by February 11th, he was in effective control of the country, including the army, which had declared neutrality and was now firmly under the thumb of Khomeini. He used this new power as supreme leader to essentially the liberal and left opposition that had helped him get into power and fully establish his theocracy, including with the help of what was supposed to be a neutral military, which had effectively disintegrated overnight. Now that we understand how the Islamic Republic came to power through this long-standing turbulence and this failed balancing act between a liberal and conservative opposition, we can now see the chances for regime change in Iran, which has become very relevant with Iran's development of nuclear weapons and its continued hostility towards the West. As these hostility and why it's building nuclear weapons can directly be explained by the revolution, as Khomeini built his brand, built his support base on a anti-American, anti-foreign influence platform. And this did have appeal among middle-class Iranians who were deeply skeptical of the US and who wanted more sovereignty for their country. And this has ultimately been the Ayatollah's backbone, as this veneer of republicanism and anti-American sentiment has, for the most part, kept the mostly well-educated and liberal Iranian population content in supporting the Shahs on top of the brutal repressions. And there have been many, especially recently, this oppression has mostly failed. In 2022, there was an uprising that was sparked after the death of Masha Amini, a member of the Bahari religious community, which was long been oppressed by the morality police, which is the supreme leaders, the clerical councils, a version of the Savats, their secret police, and they had killed her for not wearing her hijab properly. Most Iranians believe that the hijab should be voluntary, and her death sparked widespread protests and outrage across the country for obvious reasons. She was wearing a hijab, it was only not done properly as in the style mandated by the government, and they had killed her, torturing her. And so many women, especially women in religious minorities, went out, they burned jobs in the street. And for the most part, these uprisings seem to have worked. There were widespread protests, and the government has mostly backed down from its position on hijabs. The morality police, as of writing, are effectively defunct. They are still there. The hijab laws are still on the books, but they aren't enforced, and the morality police don't want to start another massive uprising, and so they mostly hung back. Many women, if you go to Iran now, you will see they are not wearing hijabs, even though this is a nominally Islamic state with strict hijab mandates. Many women are just not wearing them because they know that the morality police will no longer come from them. And this has only continued to get worse for the Iranian government, as in 2024, the Iranian election saw the reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian elected as president, which was a shocking result. After the uprising, many thought that the supreme leader and the clerical council would bar any reformist candidate from running, but they did allow Masoud to run, and even though at first he was considered unlikely to win, he eventually won a surprise victory, which really challenged the supreme leader's authority and the clerical council. And this really goes to highlight how weak the Islamic government's position has been over the past few years. It has gotten incredibly weak, and when we also consider its international position, it's looking quite dire for the Islamic government. The proxy network it had spent decades building up with Hamas and Hezbollah has now effectively collapsed. Hamas is defunct. Same thing with Hezbollah. And now its main ally in the region, Bashar al-Assad, having gone into exile and its regime having collapsed, the Iranian government is more isolated than ever. And foreign governments have seized on this opportunity to get concessions from the Iranian government. Israel has conducted strikes against Iran only a week or two ago, as of writing on Iran's nuclear facilities following the International Atomic Energy Agency's report on the non-disclosure of the country's nuclear facilities to inspectors. The strikes by strikes by Israel, and the following ones by the US under the Trump administration, which backed up Israel in attacking Iranian nuclear facilities, have only highlighted Iran's weakening position, as it is unable to defend itself against deep military airstrikes by foreign adversaries. This bodes very poor for Iran, as if a military invention were to take place, the Iranian military on its own does not look strong enough to be able to resist, especially without its proxies and without its regional allies. Both Russia is distracted in Ukraine and China is unwilling to get involved, this severely weakened Iran does look like a prime target for regime change to the American and Israeli government, as it is suffering under the weight of issues that plague the Shah. It's balancing a liberal opposition with its conservative nature, and it's this balancing act that has now been throwing it out of whack. And with its weakened geostrategic position, this has only gotten worse for Iran. But I also think it's important to point out that just because the Iranian government looks weaker than ever, this can be quite deceptive. And it's important to look at the options that the US or Israel could take with regards to regime change and what it could actually reasonably achieve. The US could try and go with the tried and true option that they used in 1953, being providing funding, intelligence, and weapons to local military forces to coup the Islamic government. However, I am doubtful of this, as there are very few signs of disloyalty among the Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian military that is controlled by the supreme leader, and anyone who could have had the influence to organize such a coup has likely been killed. Israel has engaged in repeated targeting of Iranian officers, especially high ranking ones, including the Iranian chief of staff, which was killed recently. It's doubtful that there are any leaders remaining who would be capable or even willing to engage in this kind of coup. And I don't think that it's likely in the near future to happen. And I don't believe that the CIA or the United States would, or Israel would be, or Israel's Mossad would be able to engineer one. I think that would almost certainly be a failure. There is a strong myth that the CIA is just able to overthrow governments at the drop of a hat with just it's because it can. And this is a very much a mistaken opinion, though a popular one, especially among foreign adversaries, as the CIA's abilities have been greatly overestimated. You only have to look at the repeated failures of CIA coups around the world to see the true impact of CIA's attempts to overthrow countries. I also have doubts about a domestic revolution that's based on a grassroots opposition similar to the 2022 uprisings that would overthrow the government, similar to the Iranian Revolution beforehand, that the Americans could either fund or support. This is mainly because, though the Iranian government may be unpopular with its populace, the US is downright hated. And there is very much a rally around the flag effect going through Iran right now, as Iranians feel they are under attack from America and Israel, with hundreds already dead from airstrikes across Iran. Now does not seem like a good time to bicker for Iran. It's hard to see a revolution fermenting with most Iranians' attention focused on America, which is exactly the regime's strength, as its main drawing point is its anti-American credentials, and that does seem to still hold sway for Iranians. The last option the US and Israel have for regime change is with a direct military intervention, like with Saddam Hussein in 2003 and the Second Iraq War. But there is a reason why George W. Bush invaded Iraq and not Iran in 2003, as an invasion of Iran would be a logistical and political nightmare. Looking geographically, Iran is a mostly mountainous country with poor regional infrastructure that is very much unsuitable to large military operations. To put into perspective, it is Afghanistan on steroids. If Afghanistan was already bad enough for the US military, attempting an invasion of Iran would be even worse. They would have less supplies, they would have less control over the region, with a larger population is vehemently hates America and anything to do with it. I do believe the US military could maybe secure the coast and the larger regions, but the Iranian government itself could very easily hide away in the countryside like the Taliban and engage in a guerrilla war against the US, which is probably their plan. I have no doubt that they have contingencies in place for that, similarly to the Taliban. But even moving past the Iranian government, there are a multitude of other rebels and separatist groups that would emerge in an invasion would also present a serious challenge to US forces. Look at Balochistan again, that still has an ongoing insurgency. They would likely only gain power in an invasion and would almost certainly target US forces in an invasion. The US and Israel would certainly get bogged down, and this would become another Afghanistan. And in the end, I do believe it will go the same way, with the Ayatollahs crushing any provisional government that the US established upon an inevitable withdrawal of forces. I seriously doubt Trump is looking to repeat Bush's mistake of staying for the long haul. He would go in and go out as quickly as possible, and any government established would quickly dissolve into either a civil war or just be completely replaced by the Ayatollahs. As I see it, the US options for regime change are either impossible or too difficult to achieve. If the Iranian government is going to collapse, it is not going to be now, it is going to be in the near to long future. I just don't see it happening at this moment. But it is important to preface that though we can see the underlying forces that are hurting Iran, so can the Iranian government itself. It sees that its position is similar to the Shah's. It sees its own internal opposition, the surrounding vultures of foreign influence. And I cannot speak for the Ayatollahs of the clerical council, but it's looking increasingly likely that they feel that there is an imminent invasion and that they are in a do or die scenario, that there is a good chance of collapse in the near future, and that the only way to get out is to pursue radical action, aggressive, escalatory action to protect itself. Iran is effectively backed into a corner, and all signs are pointing to an intervention. If you were the Iranian government, the only logical course of action now would be escalation, to force the US and Israel to back down and to not even risk a invasion, or do everything possible to avoid the invasion, even if that means taking a massive gamble. Iran has few options to do that anymore. The proxy network it established was its main way of keeping Israel or the Americans away from Iran itself, by diverting its attention away from the Iranian heartland. But with that dismantled, now all eyes have turned to Iran, and it really only has two options in my estimation. The first, and the least likely to succeed, I believe, would be Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz, which is this narrow gap between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran itself that is controlled by Iran, and it's situated roughly in the middle of the Persian Gulf, one of the world's largest shipping lanes for oil, with a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran going through the Persian Gulf. And Iran has threatened to cut the Strait of Hormuz in the past. It has done so in the past, but this would require significant military infrastructure, including naval infrastructure, to maintain. This is very unlikely to succeed. The US already has a carrier group in the region, and Donald Trump is probably itching to use it. I have no doubt that any attempt at a blockade would almost certainly be destroyed by the US Navy. I just do not see how the Iranians could maintain a hold on the Strait of Hormuz. Sure, they could disrupt traffic through it, but I don't think they could close it. And if they can't close it, it's not as effective as leverage. It's mostly ineffective. And especially seeing as it's hurting their bottom line as well. Iran does rely on oil for its income. It seems like a pretty poor option. The one I think that is more likely is that Iran would try and continue to pursue its nuclear program and do it explicitly, abandon all pretexts of hiding it, and just fully pursue nuclear weapons, pull a North Korea essentially, as a deterrent to aggression and to secure its power by risking total nuclear annihilation. And though theoretically this could work, if Iran does demonstrate nuclear capabilities, I doubt Trump would be stupid enough to try an invasion. But then this is kind of just begging an invasion before they even get it. This is just really just escalating the current situation without any real change in the chances of success. Iran has no real good options at the moment, and in reality, I don't see it that any of its choices would actually prevent a full-scale invasion. I think that in reality, any attempt at escalation would only increase the possibility of Trump trying a regime change. And if he does, the only real options would be a full-scale invasion, which, again, is not good for anyone involved. Iran is a fascinating country geopolitically. And as we've seen by looking at its history, the vulnerability in its position has become clear in these airstrikes that reflect previous instability. And so there is, I think, now more than ever, the writings on the wall for the Iranian government. We can see how, looking at history, how it has been suffering the problems that allowed it to rise in the first place. But I don't think this is going to lead to an actual regime change in the near future. Obviously, I cannot say for certain, but I don't think these airstrikes are going to lead to regime change, mainly because the US' only effective option is a full-scale invasion, and neither side, both Iran and the US, have effective options for de-escalation. Iran does not have effective deterrence. So I really don't see anything that would be able to come down from this crisis. I think we're only going to see further escalation as Iran, fearing for itself, continues to escalate, and Trump or Israel, with little other option to deal with the crisis, would just continue to escalate as well. And if we analyze the options, Trump has only one if he wants regime change, and that is one that will likely end in disaster for US servicemen and women. I think I will end that there. Thank you for watching this very unfiltered and poorly structured diatribe against the Trump administration and its Iranian policy. But I think it's interesting, and if you want to hear more or have any suggestions, leave a comment. Thank you and goodbye.